Yes, thank you very much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be in Zurich, and well, previous time it was much nicer weather, so next time SCION Day maybe in summer. But apart from that, it's nice to be here. I think also after the presentations earlier this morning, you have some idea about GÉANT, but let me just very briefly introduce us. We are essentially the company that connect the research and education networks in Europe to each other and to the rest of the world. And you can see that on the picture top left, that we have connectivity with comparable networks in other parts of the world, and we have our own pan-European backbone that connects all the research and education networks, and that on top of which we run a number of, let's say, infrastructural services. And if you look at the picture to the right, then essentially we talk about the network, we talk about a trust infrastructure, and we talk about collaboration on that infrastructure. And I'm responsible for the top two layers of that three-layer picture. And maybe this is more or less the moment where you wonder, what is that guy doing here then? And that's, in fact, the question I asked Adrian when he asked me for the advisory board. I said, why do you want to talk to me? Shouldn't you have a network guy for this? But I think that has to do with the other part, and that is that, as probably my one life-lasting contribution to the internet is that I came up with the idea of EduRoam. And I... Thank you. And without false modesty, I say I came up with the idea. I will get back to that in my presentation, but this is really the work of hundreds of people. And I can only take credit for having the original idea, definitely not for the state it is in now. But Adrian told me that he wanted to benefit a bit from the lessons we've learned in trying to roll out an infrastructure on a global scale, starting with a small technical proof of concept to a service that is used by millions across the world. And I thought that that is probably a good idea to also frame my presentation along those lines. In the agenda, you have seen something about GÉANT's connection to SCION. I took that out, also because a quarter is not a lot of time, but also because Adrian and David had already talked about it, and I knew that beforehand, so I decided to skip all of that. So I will talk a little bit about the history of EduRoam, and some of the lessons that we've learned in the process, and then I want to take a brief look at SCION and see how that compares. But before getting to EduRoam, I'll start a lot bigger. An infrastructure that maybe as late as in the year 2000 was not yet completely without criticism. There was still some feeling that eventually the internet might be taken over by government-organized networks in OSI and etc. But as you all know, that never happened. The internet is the dominant communication infrastructure in the world. And by the way, I just have on the top right, there is a picture of one of the original 4 internet hosts, and the bottom ones are from Digital and one from the Pentagon. So really very early machines. And what you see is that what started among research organizations grew bigger, but was very much still a research endeavor. And then this guy at CERN in Geneva had an idea. In fact, it was not a completely original idea. Hypertext existed for many years, but his breakthrough was that he turned a concept into something of practical use. Tim Berners-Lee, now Sir Tim Berners-Lee, came up with the idea of the web. Very rudimentary in the beginning, but it very quickly caught on because it was easy to deploy and it was easy to share the pictures of your cat with your friends. And I think that is kind of lesson one, and it's kind of lesson one, kind of a lesson that we try to take on board when we developed Eduroam. And I'm not going to read this out, but that lesson is that it almost always works much better to start very simple, address the immediate problem you need to address, and as you go, evolve the system. And that may be obvious, but it's not. Usually when you start into some sort of design session with people, they immediately start thinking about, but what if we had also this? And how about in 5 years' time? And that may at first seem attractive. Of course you want to design a system for the future. But history shows, I think, that is often not the right thing to do. And you might argue that while the internet started with lightweight and simple protocols, the lightweight directory access protocol, the simple network management protocol, and a whole bunch of other protocols that starts with an L or an S, if you look at LDAP version 3 that we use now, that's every bit as complex as whatever the OSI side of networking had come up with. But it never took on because at that time, that functionality was not needed. So it was way overkill for what was needed at the time. And LDAP evolved over the years to remain fit for purpose. And I think that's an important lesson that, as I said, we try to take on board also for Eduroam. So where did it all start? Actually, a little bit earlier than 2003, but sometimes you retrofit the timeline a little bit for political correctness purposes, etc. But what happened is we got I was at the time working at SurfNet, the Dutch switch, let's say, and we had a very big project that was aiming to bring internet connectivity to every student wherever they were. So, for those of you that were not born by then, you used to go to the university, you could connect to these terminals, and then you went home, and that was it. This is around the year 2000 is when that started to change, when there became modems, when Wi-Fi started to emerge. The bottom right is one of these PCM CIA cards that you back then had to put in your laptop to be able to access the internet. So things were changing, and we were doing a big project to connect all of those. And why am I talking about that? Because one thing that I will not say very explicit, but that is kind of through my whole presentation, is the element of luck. And the element of luck is super important. And you cannot do much about that. You're lucky or you're not lucky. But what I do think you can do something about is create the circumstances that increase the likelihood of you being able to profit from being lucky. And what happened here is that because we were looking so broadly at all these technologies, we could actually combine a number of technologies that we were using in different areas for another purpose. We used the technology called 802.1x. That's a way to authenticate yourself to the network and put people in a separate network. That technology we were using to bring internet to student dormitories. And it didn't work for that matter. We also had a dial-in network where we used Radius as a protocol to be able to authenticate users for access to the dial-up internet network. And really the only thing that Eduroam gives in terms of technology is just combining the two. And so basically what happened is I thought, what if we combine the two and use it for guest access to wireless networks? So I wrote an email to the European Mobility Task Force. Hey, I have an idea. Then, of course, the Swiss thought it was a bad idea. Then the Germans thought it was a bad idea. So we ended up with trialing for 2 years 3 different technologies. Switch had an idea to use VPN technology, so we had for 2 years infrastructure based on that. And in the end, what is now called Eduroam was the prevailing one. And I'm joking, of course, about the whole switch thing, because that's precisely how it is supposed to be. It is supposed to, when you have an idea, it should be criticized. It should be compared to other ways, and we did the right thing. And luckily, again that luck, the one that I had come up with turned out to be the best fit for what we wanted to do. As a little side note, the lady on the bottom left is by now for 15 years my wife, so it brings also other elements of luck. She was told to do a workshop with this guy from SurfNet, and well, the rest is history. Very briefly, for those not familiar with Eduroam, this is my only technical, semi-technical slide in my presentation, and this explains how very high-level Eduroam works. What it is you have a laptop or a mobile device, and that mobile device tries to get access to an access point, and it does so by providing his or her identity. And that identity is of the form of, let's say, an email address, person at institution. And what Eduroam does is the first radio server that this request encounters will have a very simple algorithm. It will say, is this one of my guys or not? And it determines whether it's one of its guys by looking at the domain part of that username that I was talking about, in terminology, the realm. And if the realm, well, in this case, I have university.a.nl. Basically, the university A radio server looks if the username ends in university.a.nl. And if it does, it will verify the user credentials, just like any modern Wi-Fi network will do. It will check the user credentials. The difference, and this is the one contribution that Eduroam gives, is that what if it is not university.a.nl? What happens then is that the request gets forwarded to someone that may know better, in this case the .nl radio server, and the .nl radio server hopefully knows all the universities in the Netherlands, should have a static connection between the radio servers, a trust establishment between those radio servers. Given that this is a user with a .nl username, the .nl server knows about it, will forward the request to University B. University B will do that magic of checking the username and the password, and assuming that it's correct, the response travels the same path. And here is where the trust comes in. Within Eduroam, we have established a global trust network that essentially says, if I get from somewhere in the Eduroam network an OK, then I will trust that and give the user access to the network. And that can be a specific network based on the identity. It can be the internet at large. And that also means that the resource that you're protecting is not that valuable. I joke always that we're competing with McDonald's, where you can also get free Wi-Fi access. It's a little bit more than that, because there is a trust element. You can trust Eduroam networks more than McDonald's Wi-Fi network, but it does one thing. Authentication equals authorization. If you've successfully authenticated to any IDP, identity provider, in the Eduroam network, you can get access to the network. And that picture is from 2003. Not much has changed. Not fundamentally. We have become better as we went. We have developed new technologies, for instance, to establish dynamic trust relations between the University A and the University B radio server. But fundamentally, this is still how it works 20 years later. So how did this happen? Lots of beer, sometimes strong espressos when we really had to get things done. First, with a very small group of NRENs in Europe. Then the Japanese and the Chinese picked up. And since a few years, very much in Africa as well. And I think this is another of those important lessons. You really need to create a community around it. This is not about a clever person coming up with a clever idea. In order to get these kind of infrastructural services widely deployed, you need many, many, many people across many, many, many continents. As Mr. Covey, who I think is in many ways a very scary person, but I think he did say one thing that I can very much agree with. This is the guy that with 7 principles of successful management and that kind of stuff, the airport literature. But he said one thing that I think is very important, and that it's all about trust. Usually when I talk about trust, I'm talking about technical trust, about SAML, OpenID Connect, 802.1x, but really it's the human trust that is at the basis of all of this. And by having a close-knitted community, you can get a lot of things done. So it went on. eduroam existed 10 years. We got bigger and bigger. We reached the critical mass, kind of. I think that's a very, very important point to reach, where we went from trying to convince a university to use eduroam, we went to why on earth are you not doing eduroam? I think that is the very critical point to achieve. And from then it just went on, and we did a very important next step. We standardized what we were doing. We had already been standardizing parts of eduroam. The dynamic establishment of trust relation I was talking about had already been turned into an internet proposed standard. But the one document that brought it all together, and that, for instance, a university that wanted to do a Wi-Fi deployment on their campus could just have that as one of their procurement checkboxes. It has to satisfy that RFC. I think it's a super frustrating process, I can tell you. So I wish Nicola and others a lot of strength in that. It can easily take 10 years if there is lots of discussion, but it's worth it. It is really worth it, because you have worldwide experts looking very careful at what you're doing, probably trying to trip you up, probably trying to find a way to tell you that your solution is crap. But you need that, because you don't want to find that out 10 years down the road. It's better to find it out now, when you can still do something about it, or worst case, abandon the whole idea and say it was a good idea, but it's not going to work, than that you find that out when you have a big deployment. So kudos to the team for getting this started. And then we reached 1 billion in total, 1 billion international authentications in 2016. And we are now at 1 billion a year. And that's the nice thing about this tipping point. At some point, you hit the curve, and then it just goes fast, and you don't even have to do anything about it. I worked for 9 years at Cisco. I was only very limited involved with eduroam, but it just happened. It autonomously grew into what it is now. And it keeps growing. We had a little bit of a dip a few years ago. For some reason, students didn't travel as much anymore all of a sudden. So we did see that dipping. By the way, the other widely used federated technology, GÉANT, that connects the identity federations, exploded the other direction because all those students wanted to do courses from home and things like that. But eduroam had a dip, but we are right back on the growth curve, both for national authentication and international authentication. So it keeps growing. And it doesn't keep growing so much in countries where it is being used, but it very much it becomes denser and denser, the network. So we very enthusiastically colored China blue in the map when Hong Kong University was doing eduroam. But of course, that's kind of cheating. Because the country is not small. So the chances of being able to use eduroam in China are pretty limited. And that we now really see changing. In Europe, it is very dense at the moment. Every time I walk in the street in a city in Europe, I get connectivity because there are always universities or other education buildings. There are airports that do eduroam. It's at Geneva Airport, for example. So we have reached that critical mass. I didn't make this slide myself. I may be vain, but not that vain that I put that picture of myself there. But I wanted to show this picture to show that we are getting very close to world dominance. I saw the 3 continents of SCION, and we're ahead of you guys. We're only not in Antarctica, and we're working on that. We are actually talking to a Norwegian research group that is looking at getting eduroam on Antarctica, and then we're there. But as I said, it gets denser and denser. That number, that 36,000 locations, that really every year increases with a couple of thousand. And that in the end is why we do it, of course. Of course, we do it in the end because we want seamless, secure access for all students worldwide. So, on the lessons learned, I mentioned a couple. Maybe I mentioned all of them. Pretty much. Yeah, I think so. So let's look a little bit at SCION then. And the start simple bit. I think here is where SCION is a little bit challenged. Who, when the first time they read a document about SCION, thought, of course, I understand everything. I was afraid that it was just me. And this is a challenge, and I think we need to find a way of making SCION a lot easier to understand. And the underlying technology will remain complicated. And trust me, if you read the 802.1x standard, that also doesn't make you happy. And you need to read the EAP standard a couple of times before you grasp the bigger picture of extensible authentication protocols. This technology is complex. Still, I think we need to get a simpler message. And I think the byline of this SCION Day is already a very good start. I think it's very good to focus on one aspect, and I think security is probably a good choice there. Do one thing well. Yeah, David and Adrian cheated me here. They had originally in their presentation this Swiss Army knife, but they removed it. But I think that's another challenge for SCION. It is very tempting to, if you have a hammer, to regard everything as a nail, but it confuses people. And I think this is fine down the road. It's great to have a technology that is so versatile and that can solve so many problems that we have for many years to come. We benefit from that for many years to come. However, again, I think this dilutes the message. And I think the choice of going security, security, security is a very good one. Build a community. I put between brackets global, because I think there is a very active community around SCION. I think it goes beyond Switzerland. I see what happens in Korea, in the US, in the Netherlands. Still, many people I talk to about SCION, they say, oh, that's that Swiss project, right? For better and for worse, because also the fact that the Swiss banks use it is also a sign of approval. So don't get me wrong, it's both good and bad. Still, I think to really turn SCION into a global thing, it has to be a global community. I think there have to be SCION days outside Zurich. Standardization, I mentioned it already. I took a picture that looks very similar to the one that Nicola showed. As I said, I think it's really great to see this happening. It's really great that you have something that organizations can point to and say, this is what we want, this is what we need. Not go and talk to this crazy professor at ETH, or go to this little company in Switzerland. No, this is an internet standard, or informational RFC to be precise, but trust me, nobody understands the difference. Nobody understands that a draft is not something that is a standard. Nobody understands that an informational RFC is just informational. It is important. And the get lucky. And I think this is the time to be lucky, unfortunately. I think I don't have to explain that we are in a time of many geopolitical stress, bad things happening, bad guys trying to get into, to undermine our infrastructures. So I think this is the day, this is the time for SCION, and I really think this is the moment to capture that. And lastly, just as a word of warning, take everything I just said with lots of grains of salt. It's always very easy to, in retrospect, say, oh, this is why it happened. And look how smart we were. We were also extremely lucky. We were at the right time, at the right place. But I do hope I have given you something to think about. Thank you.
So